If you start to promote and empower people or recognize and remember them without respecting them and protecting them, the game's over before you've started.
Can we agree that leadership isn't based on title or position? I have created this podcast to talk to everyday people who lead in extraordinary ways in their everyday lives, both professionally and personally, in the hope that it will inspire everyday people like you and me to realize we are everyday leaders. Welcome to Everyday Leadership. How do you create an environment that promotes, protects, and empowers people? This is a question I posed to my guest, David, today, who, as the CEO of the Commonwealth Games, looks after roughly 40,000 people, taking into account volunteers, permanent staff, and contractors. We delve into all the topics around transitioning from being an athlete, getting injured and not making it to Olympic Games, and moving into a corporate career in international sport. We talk around awareness, advocacy, and action, and how those three words helped him to champion and change the perception internationally around Paralympic athletics as a whole and with athletes themselves. We talk about Birmingham 2022. We talk about embracing protest by athletes in those games, which is completely different to how the IOC are approaching things. We talk about listening and so much more. It's a value-packed episode as always. Let's get straight into it. I have the pleasure of talking to David Grevemberg, who is the Chief Exec of the Commonwealth Games Federation. How are you doing, David?
Very well, Trumpy. It's good to be here, and I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, same here. I can't think of a better place to start than learning about your childhood and what it was like growing up in New Orleans, the Deep South, being the only one of the few white children around, and how that experience and that background has actually helped shape and mold you into what you currently do right now.
Yeah, growing up in the inner city of New Orleans, we were known for being the murder capital of the United States, being for a lot of things. We were known for having one of the highest rates of heart disease, and also our literacy levels, as well as our public school systems, were probably a lot to be desired. But that being said, we had a real richness of pride and perspective, real sense of diverse culture, being a port city, being a city that, obviously had a bit of the good, the great, the bad, the ugly, a strong colonial link in history, and of course, the legacy of slavery. You had this real melting pot of influences and so forth. And I can tell you that every stage of that journey as a child going through that, I've really realized there was lots of things that divided the community, but also some wonderful things that really brought the community together. And those were things like food, music, art and culture, and sport. And one of at the age of 12 years old, the 1984, don't do the math, but at the age of 12, the World Expo, the World's Fair, came to New Orleans. And that was the first time the city really was able to shine and start, beyond all the things that were challenging, started to tell a bit of the whole story around our character as a city and the things that we could be really proud of. And after that, both conferences, and it became a real destination for tourism and conferences, and obviously the hospitality market really started to thrive in the city. Still had plenty of challenges, but it was really the first time some of those, I would say, courageous conversations started to be raised, and our sense of identity as New Orleanians became, I think, even that much more solidified.
How did you navigate, in a sense, being the only voice, being the only white voice around in that area at that point in time, especially being so young?
I acculturated. I assimilated in many respects. So I think I probably up to the age of 12, I really had an identity crisis in many respects because all the kids I was playing with were, we all had we had our likes and our dislikes and our commonalities, and had lots of fun on the playground and at school and so forth. But there comes a time when you're about 12 years old where things start to change. And my first attempt at, I think in the UK system, it's S1. I didn't do very well, and that was a pretty interesting time where I had this divide happens, and people go their ways, and that was something that it became very profound. The issues around racial inequality and racial tension in the city of New Orleans, when it kind of affects you, and that was that was really kind of when I became really cognizant of my privilege, probably my bias, and even some of my prejudice as a young white man at that time, or young white boy at that time, which I've been constantly trying to recover from since. So it's been, but that was something, it was not really obvious until this point. And I remember asking some pretty poignant questions to relatives and so forth. And I remember making a lot of people feel really uncomfortable when I started asking them, because I had a perspective. that they did not have. I wasn't kept in a gated community, and I wasn't kept behind doors. My mother was a social worker, and gave me a real sense of what the reality is in the real world. And that was something that I really valued, and I valued to this day.
Yeah. I think we're gonna, as we go through your career, we'll start to see those values coming out a little bit more. But going on from you being a 12-year-old, you got into wrestling. I believe you made it to the US International Open, I believe.
Yep, that's right. I got to wrestle in university. I wrestled in high school, obviously, which opened up the door to go to university, and then I had the chance of wrestling a bit internationally and to wrestle at the US Open, and then I had an injury that kind of made me have to readjust and and pick up the pieces and find a new track that was going to really interest me. I studied sports management, and so I feel really privileged to be doing something that I studied and that I was interested in for a while. But what I've tried to do as part of that journey is, obviously my identity and my sense of belonging as an athlete in wrestling was a really important chapter in my life. To transition from that and using my own reflective, my own reflections during this journey, when that fall from grace moment, when you suffer an injury or you realize your career is moving on to something else. It can be quite challenging and traumatic. And so I had a lot of support. I took a very interesting journey at that point. But what I realized is the importance of understanding what skills are transferable, and what perspectives are also transferable. What are my strengths? One of the strengths is how I look at, I kind of look at the world. I have an insatiable curiosity for diversity. And that's one of the things of just understanding the diversity of a situation, and then seeing how does all this intersectionality add value. and what are the challenges around it. And so I really I like to work with systems and models, and I like to try to make sense of what people say is the nonsensical, sensical. So and that's I realized that was something that I was able to look and find patterns and so forth, and that was something that wrestling. You see patterns in people's behaviors, you see patterns in people's movements, and once you start to realize you can recognize those patterns, you know how to respond. And it transferred very, very well into dealing with international sport, working with both elite and grassroots sports, and bringing those together, using sport for social change, and ultimately creating a platform and a catalyst through sport. That maybe the world was less familiar with in terms of the power of sport. And then of course Nelson Mandela solidified the phrase of talking about the power of sport back in when he was working with Laureus Foundation, and really, I think talked about it as being that unique vehicle to take us into places that we may not otherwise go. So there's been a lot of kind of perspectives I've gained over the years at different chapters of my life, but moving from an athlete into a professional career, which I've been in for the past 25 years, was quite an important important point of reflection.
So for athletes like you were at that point in time, who can have an injury and their career is over, and who feel like they've got nothing left, what advice would you give them to help them make that move, or to realize that the skills that they have is transferable into other areas of the sport, so they can still be involved in the game they love, but just look at it from a different perspective?
Yeah, I think you need to not wait until you feel like it's too late. It's never too late, and I think that's the point. But the earlier you start in exploring your interests beyond the field of play, and that could be big and small. What's my global interest? What's my, and that may just be I want to look after my family. I want more time with family. I want I want to help the kids in my neighborhood, or gosh, I want to make sure that we have more trees around, and I'm not living constantly in a concrete jungle. Wherever your interest lies, looking at interests that are bigger than yourself, things that you can champion, I think is quite healthy and helpful in not always focusing on yourself. And I think it becomes harder and harder with this wonderful world of social media, because we become so self-consumed with our own image and our own identity and our own sense of popularity or positioning, where I think particularly young athletes looking at their place, what sincerely means something to them and stylistically fits with their vibe, I think it's quite important. But I think that requires support. It requires self-reflection. It requires openness. And I think we're seeing a change with younger athletes, that they are more willing to speak up and speak out and take a position of what means something to them. And I think that needs to be encouraged, and we need to encourage systems that don't oppress that, or suppress it, but really lift it and give it a sense of purpose and platform. That will help with transition. That will help with growth. And so as you are aspiring, inspiring, retiring, you don't fall off the cliff. You're actually able to, as you start to retire, you can bounce and come to the next ridge instead of fall down into the valley of, okay, and then try to pick up the pieces and get back up. So I think that diversifying your own views and own interest is critical. Having interest and that's hard because we, particularly elite athletes as well, you become very myopic in your perspectives and your views and selfish. You become very selfish. And I think it's learning to be more selfless early on, because the world will tap you on the shoulder someday. Yeah, when you have kids, even more so, that'll remind you that the world is not about you. So.
But you learned to speak up from a really young age. I think you're credited with changing things around Paralympic sports. And when you went in there, you were very young. I think you said you were 10 years younger than a lot of people around you. So how did you develop that courage to be like, actually, we need to change? And it was very uncomfortable conversations you had at that point in time.
Yeah.
So that's never easy to do.
Awareness, advocacy, and action. I built my own awareness of the situation, and one of the things after my injury in around 94, I started working with the Paralympic movement in 95, and started in the lead up to Atlanta. And working with a number of athletes, I realized that it was being legitimate is not just what others think of you, but also what you think of yourself. And so a number of the athletes I started to talk to were referred at that time as disabled athletes. And I used to, very controversially, I said, I started to talk with the athletes and say, well, what do you want? And everything they said is, I want to have the same services and the same opportunities and the same recognition as an elite athlete. I said, well, you are an elite athlete. So let's start acting like elite athletes, start referring to ourselves as elite athletes, and we'll put elite athlete systems in place to support you, but also standards. And what I learned at this time was that if you want to be credible in the eyes of others and legitimate, you need to first be legitimate. And being legitimate is setting standards and achieving standards. And sometimes that's hard, because with standards comes accountability. And standards comes restrictions. And standards comes systems and form. And it's less agile in that respect. But what it does do is give you a benchmark. And with legitimacy over time equals credibility. And so what I tried to do with my work with the Paralympics was to set standards that measured well to global benchmarks and that would legitimize Paralympic sport in the eyes of spectators, but most importantly in the eyes of athletes. So what athletes are not just your fellow able-bodied peer, but other para-athletes would start to really refer to themselves as elite performers, and feel that, and not always be seeking to be legitimized. And I think that was the journey. Over almost 16 years of work with the Paralympic sport movement. I had the privilege of being one of the first professional staff at the headquarters in Bonn, Germany, for the International Paralympic Committee. So essentially, we set a number of standards to ensure that athletes were feeling and performing at a level that people would feel that legitimized their performances as elite performances. And whether that was an event in terms of the number of people participating in an event and the quality of competition of that event, whether it was the number of spectators that we were able to attract, the testimony we were able to capture, all of that over time showcased a legitimate standard, which added to our credibility. So legitimacy over time equals credibility. And with enhancing that credibility over a number of years, we were really able to transform the Paralympic sport movement into a real force to be reckoned with. And, the whole notion of access, inclusivity, equality, diversity, you don't get more intersectionality than a Paralympic village. Let me put it that way, and which is wonderful. And that and also when you start to look at the perspectives and perceptions of disability worldwide, in different regions, in different countries, even different from different in rural environments versus urban environments, I learned so much. I learned so much about myself and others, and this notion of humanity in all of its forms. Whether it's whether you have a congenital disability or due to traumatic injury, and the nature of that injury, or the nature of how you were raised with a congenital disability. Everyone has a different story. So it really helped shape the way that I look at diversity in its widest form, but also the point that was made to me very early on in my career. Growing up in New Orleans, we didn't have much snow, and when I was about 23 years of age, I was charged with running an event out in Colorado, in the mountains, a ski event. I couldn't ski. And I went to this event, organized all the logistics around it, no problem, but was taken up to the top, had some of the para-alpine skiers say, "We're going to teach you how to ski." And the father of para-alpine skiing, a gentleman by the name of Captain Jack Benedict, said, this will be a great lesson for you. So they take me up to the top of a very tough slope. I knew no better, and left me. And there was a guy in a monoski, a guy with outriggers, double below the knee amputee, and they left me. And about an hour and a half later, I get down to the bottom of the slope.
Wow!
Probably more snow in my jacket than actually on the slope, with my skis in my hand. So I get to the bottom, and they're sitting there having a cup of coffee or maybe something stronger. And I asked them at that time, I said, what happened? And they said, "Well, what did you learn?" I said, "Well, I learned I can't ski." And they said, No. What you learned is you're only as disabled or different than the way people treat you and your ability to adapt to your environment.
Wow.
And what that taught me there was how, in the work that I do, help people adapt to their environments, create welcoming environments, and treat people as people. And that, no matter what the diversity. I had a guy with a visual impairment, a guy in a monoski with a spinal cord injury, a double below the knee amputee, and then there was me. And I was the most incapable at that time of getting down the hill. And I was taught later on. So we went back up the hill, a much easier slope, by the way, and they taught me how to skate, which was great. And that, for me, was a real transformative point, and also showed that later on I realized that what I'm really in the business of doing in sport is creating some of people's proudest moments. And so, how do I use the power of sport to first exercise our duty of care, respect and protect people, create that safe environment, but then ensure that when preparation meets opportunity, people can be successful. And that's about having the right power to promote people and empower people. So respect, protect, promote, empower. And then at the end of the day, it's about how we really celebrate and continue to celebrate and recognize accomplishments. And that's recognizing people and ultimately remembering them. Yeah. So respect, protect, promote, empower, recognize, and remember. And that's a continuum. So if you think of it in that kind of sequence, and that's what we do. That's what we do with major sporting events like the Commonwealth Games. That's what we do with the Paralympic Games. That's what we do with, and that's transferable. You can do that, in music. You can do that in the entertainment industry. But it really, I think how you do that, particularly focusing on that duty of care. If you start to promote and empower people or recognize and remember them without respecting them and protecting them, the game's over before you've started. So, the duty of care piece is, creating that welcoming environment, creating that safe environment, creating an environment where, people have a good foundation to be who they are is critical. And if you can't do that, you need to go back to start and start again. And that's what I've learned, is that it really starts with that.
So as a leader in your various roles, from when you worked in Germany to the Glasgow Games, and obviously what you're doing right now as well, you lead a massive team. I think I looked at the stats for the Glasgow, things like 15,000 volunteers, like 1,400 paid staff, like 30,000 contractors. That's a really big team. How do you convey this attitude and this culture that you just talked about right now in that team and make them feel that way?
The systems that I've looked at, again, going back to the systems approach, you can't just take a kind of a shotgun approach to this and just say, hope something sticks. When you're dealing with that type of magnitude and responsibility, most importantly, is that you have a duty of care for every one of those people. And you need to take that seriously. That when you fulfill a leadership role, your first priority is a duty of care. And therefore, you need to be trustworthy. And so Glasgow, we had a set of collective values, which were really important, and were on every single wall of every single office and meeting room in the organization that we had established as a collective. And that's important, collective values versus individual values. You'll hear a lot of organizations talk about what I expect of you versus what we expect of each other. And that's key, because it's bigger, as I think good leaders know when to lead and take the arrows and when to follow and praise and push and lift their teams and recognize their teams and remember their teams. Leadership is not about you, it's about others. And that's a hard lesson sometimes to learn. But when I was given the opportunity for Glasgow, I think particularly being not Scottish, not Glaswegian, not from the Commonwealth, I had one track of mind, and that was to deliver the best games for Glasgow, for Scotland, and for the Commonwealth, and for people. And so I felt a real sense of duty, a sense of pride, and responsibility. And so those values of we are trustworthy being at the basis was absolutely critical from the start. So we needed to trust others, and we needed to be trusted. We needed to constantly raise the bar. So I needed to challenge people to don't do it this way just because that's the way we've always done it. Let's challenge one another and even if it's hard conversation, to get the right result, to move the dial for everybody. And that's a hard one. But we can do that if we create a trusting environment. So we are trustworthy. We constantly raise the bar. We win together. And when we have success, your success is my success. My success is your success. Our success is celebrated by both of us. And I think that's critical, is that winning together. And then having a mindset of say what you do and do what you say. Deliver. I think what I find is many people find safety in numbers because they're afraid. They either don't trust the situation or they have a natural propensity towards, say, risk. They're more risk adverse or are driven more by anxiety. And some people are much more focused on ambition and their own interest. The key to good leadership is learning to teach people how to control that anxiety and harness that ambition for the common good. And that's good delivery teams do that. So trustworthiness, constantly raising the bar, winning together, and having that mindset of delivery that takes everyone with you and addresses the anxieties and harnesses the ambitions. And that leads to a delivery of a good project. And when you get that mentality and that culture working, you can get 46,000 people pulling all in a common direction. Doesn't mean you're not going to have challenges, but you have the ability to bounce from those challenges and address those challenges with some solidarity, which is important.
I'm just thinking, like you said at the start there, you're not from Glasgow, you're new to the role, and you're coming with ideas and principles which are not normal. A lot of people do have they're put in a box and they stay in that box, or they don't challenge the system, or they don't speak up, or they don't harness the fear and they stay on that. They don't use their growth mindset. They don't have a growth mindset, naturally speaking. So how do you, from the start, coming in with all those, I guess, things against you, how do you start to build trust when naturally they might not trust you based on what they've seen in the past?
I came into Glasgow saying, I have a lot to learn. I never run a major sport event in Glasgow. I have a lot I've done in the world, but I've never done this in Glasgow. Now, the reality is no one had. But showing respect for what had been done in Glasgow and the way that Glasgow and Scotland had a track record of running events, listening to people, not just hearing them. The differential there, I always say, is that, great, I've heard you, now let me tell you what I want to say. Versus, I've listened to you, let me reflect on that.
Active listening.
We talk about it all the time. Doing it is harder. The number of times I've caught myself and slapped myself on the wrist and said, you're not listening. You're hearing, but you're not listening. And learning about a situation. It takes engagement, going out and talking to people, but really actively listening and not throwing up barriers to them or yourself as you're listening. Am I listening in the realm of possibility, or am I listening in the realm of limitation? And so I wanted to dream in only possibilities with Glasgow. And so I showed respect, listened to people, learned, and then I finally started to open up my big mouth when I started to have a better understanding of what we were trying to achieve and what we wanted to work with and what people's fears and ambitions were, and both individually and collectively. And some of the huge ambitions that people had, there had been a lot of disengagement, a lot of broken promises, a lot of skepticism, mistrust for big publicly funded projects and so forth. You go to any city, you're going to have very similar elements. So I learned a lot about really what was and that differed between the East End and the West End and the South Side and the North Side of the city. And Glasgow's perception of itself in comparison to Edinburgh at the time, or its place in Scotland, and Scotland's place in the UK, and and we're in the lead up to the referendum, and all of those different pieces. It's a fascinating time to be involved with all of this, and to bring all these component pieces together in a meaningful way was quite critical. To listen more than you contributed, particularly from the start. Once we set a pathway and set a strategy collectively, we needed to deliver to that. But how we started that was really about understanding who are the influencers, who are going to make or break this. And what we determined was actually it was Glasgow. it was the people of Glasgow, the people of Scotland. It was this needed to be a games for the people. So, I think we coined it originally the People's Games. A number of games took that title after it, but we originally said it back in 2012 or 2013 that we aim to be the People's Games, and to be not a games that tried to be anything but what we were, not what others may have perceived, and that talked to the actual kind of essence of what we all wanted the Commonwealth to be. And that was something, when we start to bring that out. What does your Commonwealth mean to you? What does it mean to you to be a Commonwealth citizen? Has anyone ever asked you that? And people would go, no, I don't even know what you're talking about. And that was a fascinating conversation. But we did that. Now, or we got a pretty strong answer, is that, this is, the shared history, the selfless leadership, the modern ideals, something in one of all those, would come out of the discussions. And it was fascinating, because in some areas it meant people took real pride, and in others they took shame, or others real disdain, And so how do you take that brand and make it actually as a force for good? What do? You take all those component pieces and start to make it work for you. And that's how we started that in Glasgow.
So then thinking back to where we are right now with the Commonwealth in Birmingham in 2022, I guess the first question is speaking about what the Commonwealth means. What does Commonwealth mean in the backdrop of George Floyd and everything that's happened recently with Black Lives Matter, and obviously people having a lot of conversations around race?
Yeah, it means a lot. If you look at the Commonwealth, its history, the good, the great, the bad, the ugly. There's a real, its geography, very diverse, and its demography, very diverse. We have 2/3 of the world's small states and island states. We have 1/3 of the world's population, and we've got the legacies of colonialism and conflict and industry and innovation and all of these elements, that coincide. But one of some of the real issues that have come to the tide is the honesty in talking about the shared history, the amazing leaders that have come out of Commonwealth countries, some out of innovation and some out of struggle. And then, of course, some of the modern ideals that form the Commonwealth in terms of this Commonwealth after World War II, the struggle against apartheid, and this the creation of the Charter, and the most recent version being signed in 2013, which really stands for peace, prosperity, good governance, and human rights. If you're going to be the Commonwealth, you need to be all of those things. you can't just be part of it, because it's like being part of yourself. So when you talk about historical injustice, which is something that you go to many Commonwealth countries, it's a very important point of identity. Whether everyone talks openly or is comfortable to talk openly with a white guest in their midst, that's something I've learned to work with and work through, where we can have open, honest, and courageous conversations about people's true feelings around the legacy of slavery or indentured servitude, or issues around challenges in post-colonial, post-conflict situations, or issues around Indigenous truth and reconciliation, or First Nations Indigenous truth and reconciliation, religious sectarianism, which communities across the Commonwealth, dare I say probably across the world, are faced with one or some of those pieces. When you land on someone's, or you come to someone's land, people have been affected or are impacted by one or some of those issues. And so to talk openly about those issues, and maybe more honestly and openly than ever before, to understand them, to listen, to learn, and then to see how do we come together and bring these things, to the forefront to address it. What we've done is we've created a model based on peace, sustainability, and prosperity. You cannot have sustainable and prosperous communities without peace. And peace starts with a true respect, protection, and promotion of people's human rights. That's the basis. If you don't respect someone's rights, go back to respecting someone's rights. Respecting, protecting, and promoting their rights. What that allows you to do is recognize marginalized groups. And within that marginalization, there's usually naturally conflict that has derived through the past, and the need to take a journey of truth, understanding, reconciliation, and justice, or justice and reconciliation. And that's how you start to develop peace. Then you can start to work on sustainable development, but if you do not address the elephant in the room around peace, you're not sustainable. You're not, because you're not stable, because you're building the house on sand versus granite. And that's what we've realized. So our vision as an organization is that through sport, we create peaceful, sustainable, and prosperous communities. That's our vision as an organization that was adopted in 2015. And we work to achieve sustainable development and prosperity, but that comes with the focus on peace. So the conversation, as the conversations globally have started to emerge around racial equality and police brutality, and that have been long-standing and have really come to a pinnacle head around around the struggle for freedom, fairness, equality, and justice. The Commonwealth, we believe, has an important role to play in both social discourse, but also creating that opportunity for courageous conversation and brave and bold action. And the platform of sport, allowing people to be the true identity of themselves and have that sense of belonging to something that's bigger than themselves, and to make the world a better place by their very participation in an event that means something, that stands for something. That's the ideals that we're looking at. That happens to also be an amazing sporting spectacle, an amazing cultural festival, an amazing stimulus for business, and that also educates us, stimulates thought and discussion and growth. That's the construct that we're talking to, and it's complex but necessary.
But to get that stimulation, to have those uncomfortable conversations that we just talked about, and to get the peace and understanding, to a sense, you need to have the right people in the room. And one of the things that obviously has come up over the last couple of years has been when the board was created, there was, especially in Birmingham, which is one of the most diverse places in the country, there was, I think it was 1 in 20 non-white members or on the board. So there was a complete lack of representation whatsoever. How did that happen then? And
it's a flaw in the construct of probably how I think it's more reflective of the overall systemic inequality that we have in the world, because we have a largely representative board, which is by its nature. So myself as the chief executive and our president were the two representatives on the board from the CGF, as an example. Now, we both happen to wear the skin we wear. Okay. We had been talking, as we saw this board being formed and the other representatives coming to the table from the different entities, happened to all be white. And so that right there, that discussion started a year and a half ago on, okay, where are we going to, how are we going to ensure this becomes something that is much more prescribed in the future? Because that's what we need to do in our host city contracts. We cannot allow this to be left by chance. We need to actually be more prescriptive when it comes to governance and management and those pieces. And I think, I think it's never good when you're on the reactive, particularly when you've had the proactive insight. But I think I would ask people to judge us as we move forward, and also the lessons learned. And I think, I've openly said that, I am regretful for the fact that we're not more prescriptive, but we felt it's 2020 and it's Birmingham, and we're going to get this because it's Birmingham, and that's not to fault any one particular partner or group, but I think what this does do, it gives us an opportunity to have this conversation, talk about this, use this as a lightning rod moment to push this agenda further and have some really open and honest conversations about our, where do we want to go? What we did as the CGF is that, one of our colleagues, Sandra Osborne from Barbados, who's a very infamous sports lawyer. She's the president of the Barbados National Olympic Committee. What we discussed internally is that, Sandra's going to bring a perspective around the table, a voice around the table that, and expertise around the table that we don't otherwise have. Let's see how we strengthen this board by making some changes. And our president, Dame Louise Martin, and myself had a number of conversations about, okay, should I go? Should you go? What's the best way to manage our sense of responsibility and take some action here? Within, we've been talking about it for some time. The time caught up with us, and it was the right time to make that change and that decision. However, I think moving forward, we need to make sure it's much more prescribed in host city contracts that the richness of and diversity of voice and representation needs to be upheld and protected as we move forward. And I think the organizing committee is moving in this space on EDI and I think is probably more focused than ever. And I think that's a good thing. But in hindsight, I think people I think are much more aware than they were a year and a half ago and that I see as a positive, but I also say it doesn't address the long-standing issues of inequality that we have in this world, that we all have a responsibility to address and to continue to be movers and shakers on, and to uphold, not in a patronizing way, but we need to strengthen and lift people. It's about so many different things. What are the faces around the boardroom and the corporate world in general? And I think that we need to have more open and honest dialogues like this on how we shift the dial, and how do we make space and lift more people from more diverse backgrounds, to positions of authority and power.
Would you say that your view is slightly different from the rest of the athletic world? I'm just thinking about the IOC and their comments around athletes will be banned or thrown out of the protest and podium. And you've come out and said the exact opposite, where you support athletes taking the knee of Black Lives Matter and all that. So I'm just thinking, in the sporting world and the conversation you're having with your other colleagues in other organizations like the IOC, is the problem actually recognized completely, or is it just ignored? Or
protest is, you could always say one person's protest is another person's activism. It's about creating environments where you uphold certain universal principles. I would say that I think every sport federation looks to uphold freedom, fairness, equality, and dare I say, justice. Some people do it differently. And I think, speaking from our federation, it would be very hard to represent and serve the diversity that we represent and serve, and then say, well, you can't be your authentic self. So in terms of identity and belonging, and upholding those universal values, it's important to create a platform for, building awareness, advocacy, and activism. And I think that, when you put all those pieces together, giving people voice and an opportunity, or coming to an event that, truly represents in its entirety what you feel and what you represent. My question is that, is that going to stimulate protest, or is that going to actually stimulate solidarity? And so, by proclaiming this is what we represent and how would we like to manifest our support and solidarity of one another at this moment, I think this starts a very useful conversation versus, making it about the podium. Well, let's make it about the athlete. And it's no criticism of the IOC. The IOC has an enormous amount of things to reckon with, both historically as well as geopolitically. And we are, I'm not going to say any less complicated, but we're certainly different. And we have our own complexity. So, so we need to address, what we can address. But I think it's important that, that we're doing that and we're supporting athlete voice, athlete advocacy, and athlete activism as part of that journey.
What does it actually take to put together a games?
Patience, partnership, a willing and able place, and people with hope and ambition. And that's, that really brings together, games. Because if you get the right places, and they're the right places within the place that you're hosting the games, that actually brings people together. And running the programming around that in terms of the scheduling and the support and logistics and creating opportunity with that, is just the not just the what you do, it's how you do it. And so I think it's, the how and the what are just as important. So what we create and what we conceive and what we deliver is also measured on how we've done that. Have we done it sustainably? Have we done it holistically? Have we done it collaboratively? Have we done it truly in a representative fashion? And I think those are the things of, the character and personality of the brand is quite important, because it's great. We delivered 11 days of great sporting competition, but took everyone on an amazing journey for 5 or 6, 7, 25 years into the future, that people are, to that day, are still proud of. To that day, recognize and remember it being a critical moment, something they can be proud of. And so, we're in the business of creating people's proudest moments. How do we consistently do that and do that for as many people as we possibly can? That's what makes a great event. And sport, again, seeing our heroes and seeing the surprises and dealing with the disappointments is part of that journey. But it allows us to commemorate and celebrate all at the same time. And I think you get that right, you've got a wonderful, wonderful balance.
How do you then go about attracting the stars, to the athletes to come to the games, especially when thinking ahead to the changing schedules with COVID and how they're going to have everything kind of packed one on top of each other? I know you brought Usain Bolt to the games last time, so what tricks have you got? What tricks have you got this time around?
Wasn't an easy feat, but you create a platform that works, and that's it. You get the reach in terms of you get the purpose, in terms of what we represent and the influence that we can have. Our partnership with UNICEF was a great. We raised £6.5 million for children during Glasgow 2014, and used that money to benefit 11.7 million children in 53 countries with programs over 4 years. 11.7 million children benefited from those programs. Create moments that people want. You create the place that people want to be, and I think we have all the ingredients in Birmingham to create the place to be in 2022. And I think what we stand for, what we represent, means more now than ever. To saying, yep, right after World Athletics, I'm going to come right to Birmingham because I got to be there. I got to be there for the experience. I've got to be there for what it represents. And I've got to be there because I need that Commonwealth medal because of what it represents. And so what it represents becomes something quite important. What does the Commonwealth represent? Why is it relevant and resonant in this day and age? And so it's very important between being awarded the games or now and those games that we continue to reinforce what this means and why it's so important. And that'll starts to mean that much more when people start to feel that way and give it that testimony and start to use this platform to make the world more peaceful, sustainable, and prosperous through the power of sport.
Just before we wrap up, I'm just going to ask you some quick fire questions.
Okay, go for it. Quick fire.
What is the worst job you've ever had?
Oh, goodness. I have to say washing dishes. Wash dishes in a restaurant in the French Quarter in New Orleans. And that was, that was pretty tough.
What is your favorite music genre?
Yeah, I go back to hip hop all the time. So that's my roots. I think New Orleans funk with the Neville Brothers and so forth is also one of my favorites. I think those are probably my New Orleans funk and hip hop. That's it.
Oh, and I have to ask, who's your favorite hip hop artist then?
Oh goodness! I grew up listening to Wu-Tang Clan, and feel to this
I did
day,
not see that coming.
they're from Staten Island, but they had a real connection with New Orleans, and I just really liked their vibe and their story. We had in New Orleans bounce, which was derived in New Orleans, and so I kind of grew up in that as bounce was just making its move. So that was around, but yeah, it's if anyone watches the New Orleans Saints football team, they'll get a feel for crunk, bounce, and a bit of hip hop mixed in with it.
What are your 3 guiding principles or your values?
3 guiding principles: respect everyone, fear no one, and live life to the fullest.
And what would you want your legacy to be?
I would like to be remembered for making the world a better place for as many people as I possibly can impact through the work that I do now and into the future.
Wow. I'm gonna say the work that you're doing, everything I read, researching up on you are definitely someone who is keen on making a difference to everyone and getting that equality in place, like we talked about with the Paralympics, to what you've done in Glasgow, to what you're doing right now and driving that forward. And you definitely keep on speaking up, regardless of the amount of feathers you might ruffle. So it's definitely great to hear. It's definitely great to hear someone challenging the system and actually trying to change it from within as well. So
thank you, Joe. No, I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's always great to reflect and to share a perspective with others. So thank you so much.
I appreciate you coming on. This is Everyday Leadership.
Don't forget, I have show notes on my website, everydayleadership.buzzsprout.com, so check that out. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you subscribe and tell someone else. Appreciate your support. I'll see you next time. This is Everyday Leadership.
Well.